To head into our talk for this evening, our discussion with our 5 panelists. And the title is The African Penguin in Crisis. Do we have time? And I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, a brief introduction to each of the participants. Okay, Maret, I think you said you were going to highlight. There we go, Lauren. Perfect, Maret, thank you. So Dr. Lauren Waller is a species conservation planner with the IUCN. Conservation Planning Specialist Group, the CPSG, and she serves as the convener of the Southern and East Africa Regional Resource Center for the CPSG, which is hosted by the Endangered Wildlife Trust, the EWT, in South Africa. In her role, she collaborates with stakeholders to develop species recovery plans. With a background in penguin research, Lauren has worked with African penguins for 17 years in collaboration with government, NGO, and academic colleagues to mitigate threats for the species. She is currently actively involved in advocating for improved food availability, including fishing closures around penguin breeding colonies. Thank you, Lauren. And Lauren's going to just now set the context for the discussion with the different participants. And then I'm going to move on to Lorraine Pishagru, the adjunct professor, Lorraine. She's the former director of the Coastal and Marine Research Center at Nelson Mandela University. She focuses on the impact of human activities on African penguins and other seabirds. She conducts long-term studies on penguin colonies in Algoa Bay, Bird Island, and St. Croix Island, collaborating with government departments and NGOs. She evaluates science-based conservation measures, effectiveness. Recently, she reviewed the first 10 years of the African Penguin Biodiversity Management Plan, shedding light on achievements and future goals. Next up is Dr. Kata Ludinia, research manager at SANCCOB in South Africa. She's dedicated 2 decades to studying Southern Africa seabird species, focusing on and conserving endangered African penguin. Leading the African Penguin Transponder Project, she tracks the movements of thousands of penguins in the wild. Together with SANCCOB colleagues, she works to enhance habitats, combat threats, and rescue and rear abandoned penguin eggs and chicks to support the wild population. Dr. Alistair McInnes, a marine ecologist and conservationist, completed his PhD on foraging ecology of the endangered African penguin at the University of Cape Town's Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology. As the Seabird Conservation Program Manager at BirdLife South Africa, he focuses on addressing threats to coastal seabirds. And Craig Smith is the Senior Manager of the Marine Portfolio at WWF South Africa with 19 years of experience as a fisheries scientist and manager in government. Responsible for the small pelagic fishery, he led ecological risk assessments for commercial fisheries. Smith represents WWF in collaborating with DFFE, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, to implement meaningful conservation measures for African penguins and to promote an ecosystem approach to fisheries. He oversees SASSI, the South African Sustainable Seafood Initiative assessments, sardine and anchovy, stakeholder engagement and initiatives like the development of a penguin bond, a financing mechanism. So with that, just that introduction to all these incredible, this incredible team in front of us, I would like to hand over to Lauren. The floor is all yours, Lauren.
So yes, thank you to Kirsten and to the team at Unlocking Nature for inviting us to come in and talk to you today, and to all of you who've joined us for this webinar. We're a small team of part of a large group of people that are desperately trying to save the species from what really is a very real threat of extinction. And today being World Penguin Day, it's an opportunity to highlight to you the crisis, the very real crisis that the species finds itself in. Globally, seabirds are a very threatened group of animals, and the penguins are an example of that. Of the 18 species of penguin, you'll see a large number of them are having a threat classification of conservation concern, and one of those being the African penguin. In fact, of all penguin species globally, it is the most threatened species currently, and it is currently under review, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. Just a reminder for those of you who aren't aware, it's the only species of penguin that breeds in Africa, with breeding colonies in Namibia and South Africa, which is aligned to the cold upwelling system of the Benguela Current. There's only 15 colonies left in the country, and it's split between 13 coastal islands and 2 mainland colonies. And although that sounds like a large number of colonies, only 7 colonies support 98% of that population. So 5 of them are in the Western Cape, and 2 of them in the Eastern Cape. And so that's really concerning when we talk about the threats that are experienced by birds, that the concentration is in just a few of these colonies. And this just gives you an idea of the trends that the species has been facing. In the 1970s, that was when population counts first started formally being completed. But from old records and photographs and assessments from historical records, it's estimated that there's around 1.5 to 3 million birds in the early 20th century. We only now have 9,900 breeding pairs. So that really means that we've lost more than 99% of the historical population. And since 2004, we're losing 1 colony every 3 years. The bird was classified as endangered in 2010, and it's currently being reviewed by BirdLife International with the threat status of critically endangered. And not only is the threat status potentially changing to critically endangered, but modeling done by Richard Shirley and colleagues shows that there is a high probability of extinction within the next 10 years. Now, if we just stop and pause there for a moment, in the next 10 years, my son will only just have finished school. Maybe you will only just have reached retirement. Maybe you will still be within your working life. 10 years is not a long time. But this is the reality that is facing the species. And we can show you graphs and we can talk data, but very often a picture says way more than what we could ever imagine. And these are photographs taken Dustin Island on the left side and in Halifax. And you can see just within less than 100 years, just the massive difference of the birds. The most abundant seabird species is now the most endangered species in South Africa, seabird species. So I'm going to just run through very quickly and give us a broad overview of the threats that this bird has faced, and then we'll go on to other colleagues. So historically, in the 1900s, the birds were under huge pressure from guano scraping and egg collecting, and literally millions of eggs were harvested from the offshore islands as a delicacy. And you can imagine that harvesting millions of eggs would have had a massive impact on the overall breeding productivity of the birds and the recruitment of the juveniles into the population. Further, the mining or the harvesting of guano, penguins make their burrows in guano, and it was also a very disturbing activity. So breeding birds were disturbed, eggs were destroyed, and that substrate was removed. And because of the numbers of birds that have been so much more reduced, there's just not a number of birds to replace those guano extents. And so what happens is these birds need to now breed in the surface, which is before they would make their burrows in the soft guano, which would protect them from extreme climates, extreme weather. and they're exposed to the surface now. During extreme heat, the adults will move off their nest and expose the eggs and chicks to kelp gull predation. The chicks themselves are exposed to hypo or hypothermia. And so although the guano scraping stopped many years ago, the impact of that activity is still being felt today. Predation is also a significant factor in some of the colonies. These are localized threats, so the colonies have various levels of predation and various predators that affect them, but we are seeing predation at sea by Cape Verde seals. You can see in the middle photo, the seals will grab the stomach contents of the birds as they come back to feed to the colonies after a feeding trip. And then on the mainland colonies, caracal and mongoose have also been problematic. Oiling, some of you in the audience might remember these catastrophic oil spills that we've had, the Apollo C and Treasure oil spill that oiled tens of thousands of birds. In the case of the Treasure, we've also had chronic oiling where sunken ships or containers shift during inclement weather, and the birds swim through that oil. But a more recent threat to oiling is the ship-to-ship bunkering, which has taken place in Algoa Bay. And since that activity started, there's been about 3 or 4 oiling incidences where birds have been oiled from St. Croix and Bird Island. Disease is another threat. Fortunately, in the case of the African penguin, the numbers haven't been as heavily impacted as we've seen in Namibia, but over 500 African penguins were lost just on Halifax in Namibia to avian flu. And globally, the avian flu is becoming more and more of a problem and a concern for seabirds. And of course, the climate change and extreme weather events. This is going to lead, most of these islands are very low-lying, so that's going to expose the nests and the chicks to flooding events, to extreme heat, extreme cold. And we do have these episodes where we have a large number of chicks that die from either hypothermia or hypothermia. And so these extreme weather events are going to have an ongoing impact on the birds. Lastly, I want to mention about the prey availability and the reduced prey availability as a key threat to the African penguin. These birds feed primarily on sardine and anchovy, and the abundance of those fish have been known to influence breeding success and adult survival and juvenile survival. And it is considered by seabird scientists that while there's numerous threats, like I've just mentioned, that are facing the African penguin, the current likely driver of the decline that we're seeing now is food scarcity. And this is resulting from shifts in prey populations, which is driven by environmental changes, but also through competition with fisheries. And without expanded or intensified conservation action that include securing food, the conservation of the species is unlikely. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Lorianne, and she's going to be talking to us about what we've touched briefly on what the threats are of African penguins. And Lorianne's going to be talking to us a little bit about what's been done and give us some insights into her assessment of the effectiveness of those mitigation actions, as well as touch on a particular concern for conservationists in Algoa Bay. Thanks, Lorianne.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, as you highlighted, as you've seen, African penguins are facing many threats, and the impacts are accumulating because they're all happening at the same time. But while the situation is clearly extreme, many conservation actions have been put in place for some years. So there are some good news to share and some wins to celebrate. So I'd like to tell you tonight about the African Penguin Biodiversity Management Plan, or the BMP for short. So it's an important piece of document. It's a policy document that was gazetted by the Department of Environmental Affairs in 2013, which describe clear aims and objectives, the main aim being to halt the decline of the penguin, with each aim associated with actions or tasks that were attributed to institutions, named institution, and with a deadline. So that's basically a concrete guideline for the African penguin conservation. So that puts all stakeholders involved in penguin conservation together, and that was all the managing institutions of the colonies. So that's Sandparks, Cape Nature, City of Cape Town, Robben Island Museum, as well as the government, the governmental departments, the different departments associated with different threats. Also NGOs like Sandcarb and BirdLife, they're doing a lot of work on the grounds, and academics like myself. So together we meet regularly to talk about the different issues, to find solutions together, to discuss the solutions, to implement them, to measure them, to refine them if necessary. So we really finding solutions together. So what have we achieved over the past 10 years? So I'd like to focus tonight on actions where scientific data could be collected so we could measure the impact. So a lot was done, but could not necessarily be quantified. So first, there were artificial nests. So I'm sure most of you have seen some of these artificial nests and boulders. There are a few different ones there. You can see some cement nests, some fiberglass nests, those yellow igloos have been there for a while. And also the largest and newest designs that we have, which are made of ceramic. So these nests are put in place to protect the birds from the hot African sun, like Lauren described, because we removed the guano, but also from the harsh Cape winter storms, because the heavy rains and the winds can kill small chicks if they are not protected by their parents, like they used to also in the burrow. So we have put artificial nests on many colonies since we started probably late 90s already, so different types on different colonies. But with time, we have improved the designs to maximize their benefits, hence the different designs in different places. So we did a large study comparing them with natural nets. So these now open surface nests, open to predation and weather. And we found that overall, artificial nests have increased penguin breeding productivity by more than 16% over the past decades. So it's really something to be proud of. It was a lot of work to design them, to monitor them. And also remember next time we visit boulders that these nests are actually saving penguins. But maybe the most important conservation effort has been the rehabilitation. That had the most significant impact on the species. So Kata will tell you more in details about how it's done. But because African penguin is so threatened, eventually there's a policy for saving every individual. May it be an injured adult, a hungry chick, or even abandoned eggs. So when looking at the work of the 5 rehabilitation institutions that have been working in South Africa since 2012, with all the birds that have released back into the wild, which are over 11,000 individuals for the past decade. That's a lot of bite for the rehabilitators. So we estimated that we have rehabilitated between 7 to 10% of the current wild breeding population of penguin in South Africa. So we've clearly contributed significantly to slow the decline of the species, thanks to that action alone. But there have been other actions, concrete helpful interventions, like the management of predators in some colonies that were where predation was most intense, kelp gulls or Cape fur seals. There have also been education campaigns to avoid penguin roadkills, like on Robben Island or even in Simonstown. And importantly, the latest not on our watch campaign led by the Two Ocean Aquarium to raise awareness about penguins. So just to show you, there's really tremendous work being done by many people that are working really hard in the background to save penguins. But to be honest, we are failing. So the species is now about to be downgraded to critically endangered, so we are failing the African penguin. So we have slowed down the decline to buy time, but we need to do more. Because while we were attending to the threats listed in the BMB, more threats arose. So, for example, the ship-to-ship bunkering in Algoa Bay, like Lauren mentioned, it's the refueling of large ships at sea rather than in harbors, so that those ships can save time in their journey, but also to avoid paying taxes to ports and to government. And it's, of course, a risky activity. You're handling fuel at sea depending in different weathers. So since it started, we had 4 oil spills in Algoa Bay, one straight after the first campaign started, after 6 months in 2016, again in 2019, again in 2021, and again in 2022. And it was located right by St. Croix Island, close to 2 industrial harbors, which was then the world's largest African penguin colony. But since the beginning of bunkering in 2016, the colony basically collapsed by decreasing 80% in 5 years alone, and that trend carried on until 2023. So we found that the drastic increase in maritime traffic in the bay, coming in the bay to be refueled, actually doubled the underwater noise levels in the bay. So now Algoa Bay is one of the noisiest bays in the world. But paradoxically, we were just starting to study the impact of the importance of sound in the life of African penguins. So recently, in very recent research, we realized that penguins are foraging in group, in making penguin bait balls together a lot more often than we first thought. Then we also realized that when they're doing those bait balls, they catch many more fish than if they forage alone. We discovered last year that they communicate at sea vocally, probably to call each other because they're right at the surface, they can't see far. Possibly to recruit other penguins to start doing a bait ball. And we suspect they may communicate underwater, just like dolphins, to coordinate their movement to do a ball. So it's possible also that they listen to their prey, like many predators do underwater. So it's quite obvious that in those conditions, they can't operate in a noisy environment. So to attend to these relatively new threats, what we're doing as conservationists, we are engaging actively with the relevant authorities, which are the government, the Department of Transport and SAMHSA and Transnet, as well as the operators, the bunker operators themselves. So we try to minimize the risk of oil spills in the first place, but also to find ways to reduce noise levels from the ships. So basically finding solutions together that could work for both penguins and other parties. But as we know, people are the problem, but people are also the solutions. So in conservation, engagement is key, absolutely key. And another engagement that's also be key in the other and perhaps the most major threat that African penguins are currently facing, which is the issue of food availability and of excluding fishing around the most important penguin colonies. So this is now the most urgent issue to tackle adequately, and I'll leave Alistair to tell us of how we're going to do that.
Thanks, thanks, Lorraine. I think we'll move to Kata now. Kata, we've spoken about the threats facing the species. Lorraine's touched on some of the actions that have been involved in trying to mitigate that. And you are actively involved in most of the colonies, actually, throughout the country, and indeed Namibia as well. Can you tell us what you're seeing at the colonies, and in terms of the conditions of the birds that you're seeing, and more about the work that SANCOB is doing to protect and to contribute to the conservation of the species?
I should unmute. Thank you, Lauren. Lauren has already highlighted the importance of rehabilitation centers in saving the African penguin, and where SANCOB was founded over 50 years ago to respond to major oil spills, and has been very involved in oil spills and saving African penguins, cleaning them and releasing them into the wild. Nowadays, we actually deal with a lot of emaciated birds. So a lot of the birds that come through our doors are actually not finding enough food at sea. Here you can see on the picture on the left, that is a bird that is being rescued. That is a fledgling. So this bird should be actually going to sea soon, and it should actually look like the bird on the right. The bird on the right has undergone rehabilitation at SANCOB, but that is what a fledgling of African penguin should actually look like in the wild. And I think you can easily see from the picture on the left that they're really struggling to find food, or in this case, the parents are struggling to find food to feed their chicks. Sorry. We also see that in the adults. So we see more and more adults that are also underweight, especially around the time of molt. So the African penguin goes through this catastrophic molt once a year, where they first fatten up, and then they have to stay on land for about 3 weeks, in which they can't feed. And it's normal for them to lose weight over that period, obviously. But if they haven't been able to accumulate enough weight before the molt, they actually don't have enough reserves to continue to survive after the molt. So we often get these very, very skinny birds in. And here on the right hand side, you see a penguin that has arrived at SANCOB, and it gets weighed. And this penguin should weigh probably between 2.5 to 4.5 kilo, and it weighs 1.5 kilo. So these are the birds that we are seeing day to day coming through our doors. And what we do is we obviously then fatten them up, and then release them back into the wild. We also, as Lorian mentioned, deal with birds that were predated, oiled, injured, all these things. But we do see more and more emaciated birds coming. Oops, sorry. And then Lorian and Lauren both have touched on the problems of these exposed breeding. So climate change or increase of heat or of extreme weather events obviously makes the situation even worse. So here is a penguin at Boulders with 2 chicks, and you can see how these birds are panting because they are breeding in the open, and they're really struggling with the heat. So these birds, at some point, they just give up and they go back to sea to cool down, because in a long-lived species, the adult survival, in a sense, is more important from a biological evolutionary point of view. So what we see is a lot of abandoned chicks, which is actually also linked to the food availability, because it does seem with the more unreliable food availability, birds start breeding basically earlier in the year and until later in the year. So they're more and more breeding in these hot areas, hot times of the year, when in South Africa we still have these really hot days. So now birds actually start laying eggs at end of January, early February, and then often abandon either the eggs or their chicks. But then also we have these more extreme winter storms. So probably all, or at least the people that are in South Africa, remember last year and also this year not yet, but last year we had this extreme heavy rainfall, and that obviously leads to flooding. This is even an artificial nest, so it can even flood inside the artificial nests, but especially the open breeders are obviously extremely susceptible to these flooded nests. And these eggs and often chicks are then sitting in the cold water. The parents eventually abandon them, and these eggs and chicks die. So as Lorian said, we've come to the point where basically every individual counts. So that's why SANCOB, together with the managing authorities and a lot of our donors and funders, are actually supplying rangers to all the colony who work with the managing authorities on monitoring the situation, on assessing risk, but also on rescuing these eggs and chicks. So this is Gavin, our ranger in Stony Point, who is here rescuing a chick in these boxes that then gets transported to Sankop. These chicks get hand reared and then they get released back into the wild. And we've been doing that for a long, long time, and we've admitted about almost 10,000 chicks since Sankop started admitting chicks in the early 2000s. So this is an egg, for example, that is being rescued here in Simonstown, as you can see on the box. So there's these specific boxes to transport the eggs safely. So our rangers monitor the colony, and when they see that the birds abandon the eggs, then they go and intervene and they rescue these eggs, especially in these land-based colonies where we have predators like mongoose that like to just hang around the colony and go for eggs that are left alone by their parents. As Lorian mentioned, on some of the island colonies, it's kelp gulls that predate on these eggs. So eggs can stay for a while on their own, but if they are exposed to either the heat or predators, it's obviously they're not going to survive very long in the wild. So our rangers, they then together with the managing authorities, rescue these eggs. They drive them through to Sankop in portable incubators, which are actually kind of cooler boxes that you can heat up. And then they arrive at Sankop and they're placed in these chicken incubators. So those are kind of industrial incubators, and you can see the amount of eggs that we can have at any time. Last year, we even had to buy more incubators because we were literally running out of space. So these eggs then get incubated. They turn automatically, they get turned the other way around. And what's really always amazing to me is that my colleagues that work with these eggs, they can actually see inside the eggs with a very strong torch. It's almost like a ultrasound or so. You can basically see inside, and you can see the development stage of the egg. So they can say how long this egg still needs to be incubated, if it's about to hatch, if it's a freshly laid egg. And depending on how long the egg has already been incubated by the parent, the egg can be with us up to almost 40 days, which is the normal incubation time. Some of the eggs arrive and you can already see the chicks coming out or pipping. This is what's happening here. So you can see here the eggs actually start pipping. So the chick basically goes through the normal process of what would happen in the nest as well. So the chick itself makes its way out of the egg. Here in the middle, you see the little chick coming out, still half stuck in the eggshell. So these chicks are then basically born at Sankop, and then they're hand reared at Sankop together with the chicks that are rescued from the colony as chicks already. And this is, this is a very, very small chick, but, they grow very quickly, but it still takes about 70 days or more for these chicks to then be released. And you can imagine the amount of work, and especially the amount of food that they actually need during this time. And for example, in the chick rearing unit, we have people working from 6 o'clock in the evening to 9 o'clock at night, basically feeding these birds non-stop. And it is a lot of work. But the greatest thing is then obviously when we get to release these birds. So these are fledglings that have been hand reared at Sankop. They were either coming in as eggs or as chicks. And they get released back into the wild. And we have a very, very good release rate for these chicks. In some cases, it's even better than what currently the parents can do, because obviously we can buy food, whereas the parents struggle to find food, although we also sometimes struggle to buy food. But obviously we have the capacity to feed them the needed amount of food. So these birds are then released back into the wild. But as I said, it takes a lot of work, but also a lot of money to do this. So obviously we need to assess whether this intervention is actually successful, whether we are actually bolstering the wild population. And when Sankop started this chick rearing, one of the worries was that maybe these birds are imprinted, maybe these birds are actually not surviving in the wild, maybe they're not coping, maybe they don't know what they need to do. Luckily, African penguins, they don't really get taught by their parents, in that they grow up in the nest and then they get just left to their own device and they just need to do it. So luckily there are a species that is relatively easy to hand rear and relatively easy to release. But to follow them in the wild, what we do, we actually microchip all the penguins that we release from Sankop. It's basically the same microchips that you put in your dogs and cats. So they each have basically an individual number. We also microchip breeding adults and fledglings in the wild. because we obviously need to have also a comparison. We need to know how well our birds in the wild that are born in the wild that have not been rehabilitated, how well do they survive compared to the birds that we release. And this is one of our readers. This is actually at Simonstown at Boulders underneath the boardwalk. And clearly, when we were setting this up, the penguin was quite interested in what we're doing. So basically, there's this black cable that you see on the right. This is what reads the transponder tag. These readers run on solar panels. We have them now in all main colonies. So we can see, so we can't track the birds at sea. That is a different method, and I think Alistair will touch on that. This is actually just basically we know when the birds return to the colony. So they basically walk over the reader. This again is a photo from Simonstown. This is what looks a little bit like a snake or a stick here. This is the reader. So the birds walk over. They get detected. They don't even know they're being detected. We go in, we download the data, and we can see, oh, this bird that was hand reared in 2019 has now entered at Boulders. And then because we have these rangers in the colony, they can also check whether these birds are now actively breeding. So we now have a data set of over 12,000 penguins that we have microchipped. We have now over 300,000 resightings of these birds. And we are getting amazing histories of birds that were born at one colony that have now started breeding at a different colony. We see some of their movements when they travel as young birds, because they are actually found along beaches up the west coast, and they have a transponder, and we know this bird was transponded on Robben Island, for example, and it's now found in Lambert's Bay, or even in Namibia. We currently have a bird in rehab in Namibia that was born from an egg at Sankob and released in Simonstown, and has swum all the way to Swakopmund. Unfortunately, it had to come into rehab because it wasn't finding enough food. So we are learning a lot with these birds. And we're also seeing that, yes, hand rearing these chicks does bolster the wild population and is a positive conservation effort. And we're actually taking it one step further, and I'm going to hand over to Alistair, because that is actually his team's work. We are linking now these ground readers with scales. So besides knowing that the bird is still alive, that it has come ashore in a certain colony to breed, hopefully, we also know now how much it weighs. And the nice thing is basically if a bird that is breeding, for example, this is Dyer Island here in the picture, that is breeding on Dyer Island, it will leave the colony in the morning. We will know how much it was weighing in the morning when it left. We know the time that it left the colony. And then when it comes back in the evening, we know how long it stayed at sea, because we know the time that passed between the leaving and the return. But we also know how much food this bird is bringing back. And especially if it's feeding chicks, if it has chicks that need to be fed, we know how much food it is able to supply to the chicks. And actually, our dream is basically to have all this semi-automated, that basically we have thresholds. We know that if birds are staying out longer than a certain time period, if they're bringing back less food than we would expect, that they're really struggling to find food, and that in our dream world that would automatically lead to rerouting of fishing vessels, for example, closures of certain areas and those things. So we're getting a lot of information. We're basically using these penguins to monitor the environment and the food availability. But this is actually where I'm going to hand over to Alistair, because he has a huge data set of also actually tracks. So we also do track the birds, where we can actually see where they're going at sea, and he will talk about how we use this data to actually improve the conservation of the species.
Thanks, Katja. So yes, we move over to Alistair now. Lorianne has highlighted just how much of a concern food availability is for the species. You would have seen in Katja's photos the images and the condition of the birds that they're seeing in the colonies. But how do you take that knowledge and how do you turn that into conservation action? And so Alistair is going to be taking us through the work that he and colleagues are busy with, where they are looking to understand the foraging behavior of African penguins, how they interact with their marine environment and the sardine and anchovy, and how we can take that and identify relevant conservation actions to improve their access to food. Thanks, Alistair.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, as the previous colleagues have mentioned, there are many threats to African penguins, and Lauren gave a neat summary of all of those and what's being addressed. Unfortunately, the population is still declining at a very worrying rate, and there is evidence, long-standing evidence, to show that the availability of their prey, as Lauren mentioned, is one of the key drivers of this population trend over time. So this graph on the left is from Rob Crawford, who was one of the main scientists who raised the alarm bells about the impacts of the availability of sardine and anchovy on the population decline of the species. So what you see in this graph here is the top one is for the western colonies, Robben Dassen Island, and the bottom one is for the colonies in the Eastern Cape. And the black diamonds are fish and the squares are penguins. So the fish is basically assessed from acoustic surveys by government since 1984. So they get an estimate of the biomass of the fish, and that's the combined biomass of anchovy and sardine together. And then the open white squares are African penguin breeding pairs. And what is very clear in both regions in South Africa is that these trends are very closely aligned. So there's no other variable that can explain these big fluctuations in the African penguin population since the biomass of their prey has been recorded. So this is really significant. So these findings by government scientists in the early 2000s initiated the need to look at what is the actual impact of purse seine fishing around African penguin breeding colonies. And why is that a concern? So purse seine fishing is the largest commercial fishery by tonnage in South Africa. It targets small pelagic fish like sardine and anchovy, and African penguins are specialized foragers. So they're not generalized foragers. They can't adapt easily to other prey. They're adapted, as Lorian mentioned, to fishing on schools of fish, fishing in groups, and they benefit from schooling fish. So there was concern among scientists about what are the impacts of fishing, especially around breeding colonies, when African penguins are limited to a much smaller area around their breeding colonies, because they have to return to their colonies to attend to both eggs and chicks, and they can't fly, so they have a really limited foraging range. In a first experiment internationally, looking at the impacts of fisheries on threatened seabirds, an island closure experiment was initiated in 2008 in 4 colonies for the large colonies at that stage: Dassen and Robben Island on the west coast, and St. Croix and Bird Island in Algoa Bay on the southeast coast. And the way this experiment was set up was at that stage, they didn't have much tracking data, but they had some information to suggest that birds at some colonies would go about 20 kilometers from their colony during the breeding season. So they put 20-kilometer closures around all 4 colonies, and then they alternated these closures in each region. So for the west coast, Dassen and Robben Island, if Robben Island was closed to fishing, then Dassen Island would be open for 3 years, and those rotated on the 3-year regimes to control for local natural prey availability in those areas. Unfortunately, in the southeast coast, Bird Island gets very little fishing, so it wasn't much of a control. And then the other issue with the island closure experiment was that the 20 kilometers was not fit for purpose for all the colonies. So at St. Croix Island especially, and Lorian has showed this in a couple of publications, the birds there regularly forage up to 30 kilometers from their colonies. So these 20-kilometer closures weren't ideal, but they were better than nothing, and they gave scientists an opportunity to look at the impacts of purse seine fishing on various responses by African penguins, including their foraging effort and their breeding success. Unfortunately, it couldn't measure other important parameters like survival of adults and juveniles, and also recruitment into the colonies, because African penguins only breed from between 3 and 6 years old. So the 3-year regimes didn't afford the opportunity to measure recruitment back into the colony. So in 2018, Richard Shirley published the first results that demonstrated the benefits of island closures to African penguins. So 10 years after this, the initiation of the feasibility study and then the experiment, he demonstrated that there was a biologically meaningful benefit of these island closures to African penguins. And at that point, a lot of the other penguin scientists and NGOs got together and advocated to the minister to now extend these closures to the last remaining 6 colonies in South Africa, given the downward trajectory of the species and the worrying concern that the species could go extinct within our lifetimes. So there had been a lot of back and forth with government, and in 2021, the government initiated what was called a governance forum. So they got all their scientists together to look at this issue in depth, and they presented a very detailed report that unpacked some of the issues around what penguins were going through more broadly, like some of the threats we talked about earlier, what was being done about them, and how did that sort of contextualize this threat of food availability around colonies. They came out with a proposal that the minister announced in 2021 for a set of closures, but that was subject to the stakeholders engaging around the extent of those closures and how long they'd be in place. And that was what they called the extended task team. Unfortunately, the fisheries and conservation stakeholders, some of us are here today, did not come to an agreement on suitable closures. So that led to an impasse. And there was subsequently another process in the Consultative Advisory Forum on Marine Living Resources, which similarly did not get to a mutually acceptable situation with closures. So a long road while the penguins were declining rapidly, unfortunately. And during these processes, one of the aspects that we were heavily involved in was actually looking at what areas do we actually need to protect around the last 6 colonies. And thankfully, many of the scientists here and others not here today had been collecting tracking data using these small miniaturized loggers that you fit to birds just for one foraging trip on a day. And then when they come to swap over with their nests, you retrieve the logger, and that tells us where the birds go. So why is this important? So if we collect this data over many years, and this data has been collected now since the start of the island closure experiment at most colonies by most people in this room and others, you can get a picture of actually what are the areas they use most, how far do they go, what are the most important areas. So we used a method developed by BirdLife International to identify their most important areas, and they're called marine important bird areas. And you translate that data into its broad foraging range, but then its core area, so the most preferred areas, and that's the red outline in the bottom picture there when you translate this data. So we felt that those areas were crucial to protect from resource competition. And in many instances, those areas were actually smaller than the 20 kilometers, but in some instances, like St. Croix and Dye Island, they were actually larger. So they were much more geared to where the specific movements are of birds for each colony. Given the impasse in not finding mutually acceptable closures between the fisheries and conservation sector, the government initiated an international review last year, and that was concluded and released by the minister in 2023. And that review confirmed the biological significance of island closures, firstly, to African penguins. So it put that argument to bed in terms of what is important. Are closures important to African penguins? Does it make a meaningful population difference? And that was affirmed. And the other thing they were tasked to do was to come up with a trade-off mechanism that can find suitable island closures that balance both the cost to industry with the benefits to penguins. And that was important because we couldn't come to an agreement with the fishery stakeholders. We couldn't come to acceptable closures that would meet the needs of penguins and minimize cost to industry. So they proposed this trade-off mechanism that we've since applied using the existing data that is available. And unfortunately, in August of that year, the minister proposed 2 things. One of them was good, that there'll be now long-term closures, 10 years with a review after 6 years. So that was much more aligned to the biology of the species. So we would see the benefits of longer term closures. So that the time aspect was good, but the space aspect was not. So the space aspect was, do the closures but are they representative of the most important areas, these core or preferred foraging areas? And is it balanced in terms of the trade-off assessment that the International Panel Review recommended? Unfortunately, what ensued there was that the interim, what we call these interim closures, were implemented, and they were designed and implemented before this panel review. They were not a product of this trade-off mechanism, and in many instances, the penguin scientists were not happy with the extents because they didn't cover large portions of their preferred foraging areas. And the minister announced that those would be in place unless the fisheries sector and the conservation sector could come to an agreement again. Unfortunately, as with previous engagements, we couldn't come to an agreement on mutually acceptable closures, even using the trade-off mechanism. And those older closures came into effect again now in the permits this year. And this is the reason why we're challenging the minister on that particular issue around the rationality of the decision to have the interim closures as fallback options. So I'm not going to go, there's quite a lot of detail in this map here, but this shows the 6 colonies in the 3 regions in South Africa: West Coast, South Coast, and Algoa Bay. And the orange lines are the current closures implemented, and the black lines are the closures that are aligned to a balance point in the trade-off assessment that the panel recommended. So those are the ones we feel need to go in place now, given the available data we have. And I'll just zoom into one example, which is closer to many of us here, where we work quite often at Stony Point and Dye Island on the south coast. Stony Point is similar to Boulders, gets lots of visitors every day because it's a land-based colony. Supports a lot of employment of both rangers in the colony, but also subsidiary businesses like ecotourism and those sort of things. So if you look here at these 2 colonies at Dye Island and Stony Point, you'll see the orange solid lines of the current restrictions for purse seine fishing. And you'll see these little black peppered dots all over the map. Those are the location of sardine and anchovy catches from purse seine fishing in the last 12 years. And what you'll see that's very clear, if you look at Dye Island, the solid orange line, there's very little fishing in the current closure. So for us, it's the status quo. It's not, it looks like a closure on paper, but it's really not changing anything. And if you look at the foraging range of penguins, which is the shaded green area behind Dye Island, that's the full foraging range. It's just a fraction of that area. So what we're proposing as a balance is to take that broader area, which is hatched green and orange. At the moment, they allow vessels only smaller than 26 meters, but there's still a lot of purse seine fishing there. So we're proposing that whole bigger square becomes restricted from purse seine fishing. And then if you look at Stony Point, there again, similar thing. The orange square has very little fishing over the last 12 years in it. And what we're proposing is that core foraging area, which is the green area over there, which according to our trade-off assessment also matches the balance point in balancing the needs of both commercial fisheries and African penguins. So yeah, that's where we're at, and we're just hoping, given the crisis the penguins are in, given the science that backs up the need to protect their food supplies around breeding colonies, that sense will prevail and the right closures will be implemented. As a matter of urgency, we haven't got time to waste now. We're losing a huge percentage of the population every year. And as Lauren mentioned, this population's heading for extinction if we don't act soon. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Alistair. So we've spoken and focused our discussion on the African penguin. But obviously, the African penguin is but one species that relies on sardine and anchovy. It's but one of the species within this ecosystem. And so we're going to close our discussion with you this evening by going to Craig now. And Craig, can you share some of your thoughts and insights from an ecosystem perspective in terms of what this data and what this information is indicating to you from an ecosystem perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, and good evening all. It saddens me in terms of just listening to my colleagues in explaining the plight of the African penguins. It's kind of unthinkable in today's age that we got a charismatic and iconic species like the African penguin that is possibly going extinct by 2035. We need to act with urgency. We need to act soon to arrest the decline. So these are major issues, but that's not all we stand to lose. And I guess that's what I would like to emphasize in terms of this particular presentation, is that the African penguin is an indicator species. It's an indicator species of the health of the ecosystem, in this case, the Southern Benguela ecosystem. And it's very much like the canary in the coal mine. So it's not just this particular species that's indicating that we have a problem in the marine ecosystem. The warning is also echoed by other seabird species, which are also indicator species, such as the Cape cormorant, the Cape gannet. They're also following very similar declines to the African penguin and are also listed as endangered. So what is going on in the marine ecosystem? So the basic reason for this decline, and there are many reasons for the decline of these seabirds, but the one key contributor that has been raised that stands out above all of them is this issue of resource competition. And is resource competition linked to the issue of low biomass of small pelagic resources? And we're talking particularly here of sardine and anchovy. Now, sardine is basically, over the last 20 years, sardine has basically been considered depleted. This is the West Coast sardine stock. At this present time, anchovy is considered below the average annual levels. And these species are critical in the Southern Benguela ecosystem. They provide the food for many, many top predators in the ecosystem. It's not just seabirds, but it includes top predator fish such as snook, yellowtail, geelbek or Cape salmon, but also Bruder's whales, seals, various species of sharks. So they're all dependent in one way or another on a healthy biomass of sardine and anchovy. And if we are not careful in terms of how those resources are managed, we can expect that there'll be ripple effects across the Southern Benguela marine ecosystem. And it's not just the ecosystem that stands to lose out. It's also all those associated activities, various fishing sectors, and I'm not talking just the small pelagic sector, I'm talking about other fishing sectors such as the lionfish sector, such as the hake sector, very important sectors in the fisheries economy, but also issues such as ecotourism opportunities that could be lost, that are indirectly linked to a healthy sardine and anchovy biomass. So this at this point in time may sound a lot theoretical, and I wish it was the case. But if we turn our attention to Namibia, I think Namibia provides us with a very telling and scary case in terms of what can happen if we are not careful in terms of how we manage our resources. And I'm referring to the Namibian small pelagic fishery. So one thing you need to understand is that the Namibian fishery, when it comes to sardine, it made the small pelagic fishery in South Africa look puny. I mean, it's probably 4 times the size of the small pelagic fishery in South Africa in its heyday. But in the 1970s, that sardine fishery crashed in Namibia. And what unfolded was very similar to what is actually happening in South African context at the moment. So industry scrambled. Industry looked at ways in which they could compensate for the depleted state of sardine and started focusing their attention on other species such as anchovy. They also compensated for the decline in catches by importing sardine from other countries. And this was a means to keep their operations going. But this didn't last long because anchovy was the next species to actually succumb. And basically it was depleted and also crashed. This left basically the fishery in a very tight bother. And while all this is happening, you have the issue of that the seabirds, the African penguins in Namibia, Cape gannet, the Cape cormorant, all are on decline, and the alarm bells are ringing. That basically we have a major issue in the Namibian marine ecosystem. What followed then was some environmental anomalies. that put the final nail in the coffin for basically the Namibian fisheries. And that was some heating events that took place in 1972, 1984, 1995, and an event where a low oxygen event in 1995. With those disruptions in the environment, it actually shifted the ecosystem to the fact that basically, instead of sardine and anchovy dominating the marine ecosystem in Namibia, this was then basically became pelagic gobies and jellyfish. The scientists in Namibia were calling for basically a moratorium on the fishery to be banned since the late 1990s already. It was only in 2018 when that fishery was closed by the minister. So that fishery was ostensibly closed for 3 years to allow for sardine and anchovy to rebuild. The unfortunate situation today is that that fishery still remains closed today. That is more than 5 years later, there hasn't been the rebuilding of those resources. So what has Namibia lost in that process? Yes, sardine and anchovy remains depleted. These seabirds that depend on those resources still are on the decline. In addition, in terms of the contribution to GDP from an economic point of view, it remains basically they completely lost out on that, let alone the job losses that are associated with the fishing and the operational component of that small pelagic fishery. So that is something we would want to avoid at all costs. So this is not just something that is hypothetical that could happen. We have our neighboring country, Namibia, that has shown if we are not careful, we could very easily end up in that same position where it's not just the penguins at stake. We could have a whole host of other knock-on effects in the Southern Benguela marine ecosystem. And I thought, I borrowed a cartoon, which I thought was actually just very well put. And I just want to share this cartoon with you. It's a bit provocative, but I think it tells a story that that we need to, that resonates very strongly with me. So I don't know if you can see that, but basically coming back to the issue that penguins are like the canary in the coal mine, it's warning us that we have issues in the marine ecosystem. We need to take that warning seriously and we need to act upon it. And the important thing is that some of the drivers, so yes, South Africa is a developing country. We have aspirations for economic development. So that's not entirely wrong. But we need to ensure that with those aspirations, that we do not exceed the sustainable or ecological sustainable limits, and that we heed the warnings of the natural systems, so that we don't end up in a situation where we face catastrophic losses in terms of components of the ecosystem, or whether an ecosystem functioning, as well as all other economic activities that are related. So this is a dire call that we need to act with urgency. We need to heed the call of the African penguin, and we need to ensure that economic activities like fishing is done in an ecologically sound manner. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Craig, for that sobering and yeah, really good conclusion to our team talk. And so Kirsten, that's what we have for you tonight, and to the participants. So and we're all very happy to take questions.
Sure, Lauren. You make it sound like that was very little that you've offered us, but it was actually absolutely incredible and very rich. And I share Craig's sentiment. He mentioned how heartbroken he feels listening to all of his colleagues. And it is I also share that heartbrokenness, listening to the plight of the African penguin. And at the same time, I really admire and appreciate everything that all of you are doing. I'm actually it leads me straight into the questions that we've been having in the chat. The first one that came up was by Gemma Field, and she actually had 2 questions or 3 questions, I think, but the one that she asked, which was, how can we as citizens put pressure on DFFE? That's one I thought would be quite a nice one to start off with. And I'm not sure, Kata or Alistair, whether you would want to answer that.
Yeah, I can maybe try, and I'm actually seeing maybe it fits into the last question that just popped up into the chat. I think raising awareness and as Craig showed, kind of making government understand that it's not only about the African penguin, that it's not some people that love to watch birds or because it's so cute, that it is actually a much bigger problem. So I think it is very much about showing the government that people are interested and people are concerned, but also showing what is all at stake. That there is actually, so obviously the fisheries, one of the arguments is, you know, yes, there will be job losses if the fishery closes. But there will probably even be more job losses if we lose the African penguin and the entire ecosystem, be it in other fisheries, being the tourism sector. So I think kind of, yeah, raising the awareness is obviously a key point. And obviously also supporting our work. I mean, all this work is ongoing. So everything that we have presented, we are not stopping now, and we're also not sitting back and waiting for the minister to answer. All this work is obviously ongoing, and we've highlighted a lot of conservation measures that are urgently needed. So yes, there is a lot that can be done, you know, supporting BirdLife and SANCCOB, the other organizations involved, and just, yeah, raising the alarm bells. I don't know, maybe some of my colleagues have something to add.
But maybe I can just add to that quickly. You know, we've tried to show during this discussion that there is just so much science there, and that's showing how food availability is a crucial driver. And you know, within the scientific fora that we've been part of, we've done everything that we can, and the decisions that are needed are really not being made. And so one of the things that you can do, and I see Judy Mann has put that link in the chat, is, you know, we desperately need the public to care about African penguins. We need the politicians to realize that the public is also concerned, and that it's not just an issue for, you know, the communities that live around the coastline. And write to the minister, and the Not on Our Watch has made it really easy for people to go onto the website and to find out, you know, how to do that. But write your letters of concern, but also engage in social media. The organizations on this call, they all have, you know, various hashtags. You know, all of these conversations are kind of followed, and we need to build this public support for the conservation of the species. We need to get public support, which will hopefully translate into the political decisions that are needed. So do go ahead and look at those websites, because they've made it really helpful for the public to engage.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Kata. I'm just wondering whether Gemma Field would like to ask a question live, because she has put a couple of other questions in the chat, and I'm not sure whether she still would like to ask them or whether they've been covered. Gemma, would you like to come on?
Hi, sorry for like hijacking everything, and just because it's all of my insane, highly militant questions about saving penguins. My apologies. I'm just over keen. I just want to know, like, how, I don't know. I just did a quick Google search and I saw that Barber Creasy is associated with Hermanus. I don't know if anybody with the Hermanus ANC constituency. I don't know if anybody here is in Hermanus. I just feel like we need to take this like to Parliament, you know, get up in their faces. I just want to know, like, also I want to know about St. Croix, and if that's still salvageable, and just, I don't know, I just feel like I'm just searching for the sort of drive that we as like civilians can do to really, you know, because we can send 1,000 emails, but she can just say delete all. So, you know, I just want to, you know, I don't know, I probably sound crazy, but yeah.
No, I can maybe come in there, because funnily, apparently she also has a house in Simonstown, for
Of course she
that
does.
matter. So we, for example, started working with the Simonstown Civic Association and the Business Association, and they obviously have their own reasons why they want to see the African penguin survive, and so that is obviously, you know, where we get traction. And as Lauren says, you know, yes, we can be the scientists and we've presented all our science and everything, but we do need the public to be more vocal. And yeah, so the Simonstown community is planning their own event, completely independent from us, because they have an interest in the African penguin. So there is a lot that can be done.
Okay, thank you. When I next go to Hermanus, I will certainly look her up.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. I think we
Thank you, Gemma.
definitely share your concern. I'll jump on the St. Croix question. Yes, it needs to be brought to Parliament, and I think that's where the awareness of the public is key, because at some point knowing people in Parliament will react. And we have tried and we keep trying, but the more people trying, the more chance we have to win. But on your question on St. Croix, I'm a desperate optimist, so I think it didn't come back. Actually, it is coming back this year, so it is very early to say. But there's been some issues around bunkering, and they stopped for now 8 months. And also the closure has been on since, the fishing closure has been on since end of 2022, even if it's not enough compared to what we would like. It's still the closures. So we're hoping that because of the combination of no fishing and no bunkering, that will really help, that increase in the penguin population on St. Croix will continue.
Thanks, Lorianne. I was just, Marty, I think I'm just going to ask you just to be patient just for a second. And I'm just going to ask Enrico and Janari to, if he's there, to unmute himself and ask his question. And if not,
they replied to me. Thanks. It was about
sorry,
what
Enrico.
happened in 20. It was about what happened around 2000 and what was 2007 or 17, and there was related. Alistair said it was related to the increase in biomass. So this was quite evident there. Thank you. But sorry, if I may, sorry, I have a question. Do you guys think that if you create the exclusion zones around those islands that you would like, but outside those exclusion zones, fisheries can go as before, do you think enough fish will come in to support the development of the birds in those areas? So is it and I know you're trying to get more, and it's already difficult, but I wonder whether that could be even enough, because the sardine could be just fished out just around before they reach those areas. So whether a more, even a more holistic and even more presumptuous, or I don't know whether it's the right term in English, but the more daring my program or might be needed best. Sorry, but yeah, considering where we are now. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And when we talk about closures around the breeding season, we're not saying that's a silver bullet that's going to change everything. It's a very important part. It's predicted to have a significant impact in terms of the population, but it's really important that those closures are fit for purpose. So if we have ones that are too small, and then you've got fishing on the outskirts of them, what's called fishing the line, and Lorianne's published on this for St. Croix before, when the closures were too small there, you can have what they call downstream impacts, or impacts that come from out the closure that affect the birds inside. So so what we need now is the most representative closures as much as is feasible. And we need to monitor them, because each colony is different in terms of the dynamics of the fish. So on the west coast, you have, for instance, islands like Dasson and Robben Island. And at this time of year and going into winter, you've got the anchovy recruits that are swimming in a very predictable way downstream and close to the shore. And those are the fish that the breeding penguins are going for. So now if you've got intensive fishing to the north of the colonies, you can have these downstream effects inside the actual closure area. And that is a concern and something we're worried about, especially for Dasson Island. We haven't got the science to demonstrate that yet, but it's well-known impact globally. And it's something we need to monitor before the review in 6 years' time as well. And then the question expanded to talking about the stock more generally. And Craig summarized this neatly with the example of Namibia. But that is something in terms of the recommendations of the international panel was one of the priority research avenues for the future is to review our harvest control rules in terms of seeing how aligned they are to an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries. And in this instance, are they providing enough fish also outside the breeding season for African penguins when they go a lot further from their breeding colonies? So that's definitely a concern, and that has been highlighted by the international panel as a priority to look into as well. I hope that's answered the question.
Thank you, Alistair. It was a great answer. I'm going to ask Marty to unmute himself and ask his question. Thanks, Marty.
Well, guys, thanks. It was an exceptionally thorough talk because I had more questions and you answered all of them. So I just wanted to ask one more. I mean, ultimately, the anchovy and sardine numbers, are they only due to the overfishing, or is there also something related to water temperature or pollution or any of the other aspects? And then sort of a second part to the question, we need to try and, increase the number of penguins and, get the babies, but if there's not enough food, is there a way that we can actually artificially boost the number of sardines and anchovies, whether it's in fish farms that get opened or fish farms that specifically feed the penguins or anything? Or is there also even a further problem in the whole system where the food of the sardines is actually being depleted, like whatever it's, I guess it's plankton or phytoplankton or something like that? So maybe, I don't know if this is at Chris or who's the right one to answer that question. Not Chris, sorry, Craig, sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks, Marty. I think that's a very good question. Yeah, the issue of what's causing this decline in the population of sardine and anchovy, it is a very contested debate between scientists. Some scientists are basically saying there is the impact of climate change. It seems to be there's a cooling effect on the south coast, and that's kind of allowed for the sardine and anchovy stock to move further eastward, so like an eastward shift for those particular resources. And when they're found in that particular area, they are their productivity is not quite the same as if they were on the west coast. And this also impacts upon recruitment. So there's that school of thought, but there's also the other school of thought to say that there's also basically impact of fishing on these resources. And the issue is that with poor monitoring of this particular fishery, with also known court cases in terms of corruption and underreporting in this fishery, issues of dumping, higher grading, all these issues that are kind of not really being brought into the public domain, could have a very material impact on those resources. So, and if you were to ask me in terms of where I would put my money, I would say it's probably somewhere in between climate change and the impact of fishing. Probably very difficult to tease those apart. But coming back to Alistair's point, what needs to happen as a matter of urgency is that as government considers how they manage the small pelagic fishery, as it is currently done, it's managed on the basis of a single stock approach in terms of looking at the abundance of that particular resource. such as sardine and anchovy, but there's very little consideration in terms of the threshold that's required in terms of those resources to meet the food requirements in the broader ecosystem. So that is something that needs to be done, particularly for this fishery, because this fishery has such a potential knock-on impact for a whole host of fisheries in that Southern Benguela marine ecosystem. I hope that answers the one part of your question.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
And then the other one was in terms of just being able to, I think, probably just like farm sardine and anchovy. I don't think that would be entirely possible, just because the volumes that you're talking about, and also just the complexity of their life history. So they have a very complex life history for such a short-lived species. And basically they rely very heavily in terms of the upwelling systems that produces the phytoplankton. We will never be able to generate that sort of productivity to be able to feed those resources. So I think that's just something that at this point in time, probably not something that we could do effectively. So the best thing is basically to ensure that the fishing impacts are well managed, so that we have a small pelagic resource that not only sustains the fishery, but also that sustains all the top predators in the marine ecosystem, including the African penguin.
Okay, no, great. Thanks, Craig. Is the phytoplankton then actually becoming too populous if the sardines aren't there? Because surely that's also getting out of balance if the sardines aren't eating them.
Yeah, so they would also have a very short life cycle as well. So basically, and they'll typically, it's blooming when nutrients are available and when conditions are right in terms of availability to the sun. But if the water column which they curve, it's moved offshore or deeper, phytoplankton will die. They're not able to photosynthesize. So, and then basically, yeah, you're not going to get those. It's only in cases where you get basically certain conditions where the wind after howling southeasters dies down, and provides the nutrients in the water column, that you can get algal blooms. And you probably heard about some of the impacts of these algal blooms in terms of walkouts, rock lobster, etc. on the west coast. So those things can happen as a result of when you have, but that's more in terms of environmental conditions that allow that, as opposed to not having the biomass to feed off the phytoplankton.
Awesome, thanks. I'll save my other questions for later.
Thanks, Marty.
Thanks.
Thanks, Marty. So I just wanted to make two acknowledgements. One is that Judy Mann is in our audience, and I know that Judy Mann has done incredible work as well in conservation of penguins. She has, I think she's the founder of the Not on Our Watch campaign. I might be wrong about that, Judy. And she's been putting in the chat a whole bunch of interesting links to the new comments about the new penguin exhibition at the Two Oceans Aquarium. And yeah, Judy, and thank you very much for your work as well. And then I see that there's a very nice, yeah, sorry
to interrupt. Judy is unmuted, and she would just like to tell us a bit more about that, if you don't mind.
Sure,
thank you.
Please do, Judy.
Thanks very much, and thank you to all the presenters. Thanks, Kirsten, and all the presenters for the incredible amount of work that's gone into looking after the species. Everyone has worked so hard, and our role is just a small role, which is really working on trying to raise awareness. So, chatting to several of the people on the panel today, actually a year and a half ago. And there was a plea to say, can't we raise more awareness? So we said, okay, what can we do? We can't just sit by and watch this happen. So with the Two Oceans Aquarium and with partners, all of whom are represented, as well as many other partners, we started the Not on Our Watch. And those were actually the minister's words. She said, not on my watch, or not on our watch, will the species go extinct. And that's really what kind of we used as the words to have this campaign to raise awareness about the African penguin. We have several calls to action, and that really depends on where you live. And the one call to action that everyone can participate in is email the minister. Tell her you care about penguins. Tell her that you don't want the species to go extinct. You want your children, your grandchildren to see African penguins wild. So that's something that we've made very easy on our website. And thanks, Chris. I see you've put the website on in the chat. So that's one thing. Last year, we raised up to the point where for African Penguin Awareness Day in mid-October, we had waddles in over 15 countries. We managed to get the campaign onto some of the big news channels in America. Florida Aquarium were a big partner with ours. And this year we're opening a new African penguin exhibit. It's an exhibit that really tells a story about the African penguin. We've been working hard on it for about 6 months, and it's just about ready. So all in all, it's just about raising awareness, making sure the minister knows, making sure that the other decision makers know that we care about the African penguin. We're watching the decisions that are made. And as time goes forward, what other actions are we going to take? We'll be thinking about those. So I think really that raising awareness, please use the campaign. We've got Instagram, we've got other social media. We're happy to share, we're happy to help. And we're just one small cog in a very big wheel and group of people who are passionate about the species. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Wonderful. I see a question that I'd like to direct to Lauren, and time is getting short. It's already 8:30, so I think it's about time to start wrapping up. But Lauren, I was wondering if you could answer Mark Kemner's question, The African Penguin in Crisis, Do We Have Time?, which was the title of the talk. He says, you did not answer the question, but your data indicate no, even with catastrophic intervention. How can the loss of this species help change policies where change can affect the species outcome? Should that be your focus now?
Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks, Mark. That's a great question. I think all 5 of us are not yet ready, and not just the 5 of us, the host of other people, Judy and very many others that are involved. You know, we're not yet ready to give up on what we're doing and what's needed for the African penguin. But while it's as Craig mentioned, an indicator, a canary in the coal mine, it's a poster child for what can be done in terms of success or what failure. And we've seen that when conditions are right, the penguins can breed and recover really quickly and respond to those conditions really quickly. We've seen in the colonies at Robben Island where it crashed, and when the threat had been removed, when harvesting had stopped, egg collection, the disturbance, that colony responded really well. We've seen how the Betty's Bay colony, the boulders at Simonstown, we've seen how quickly those colonies can grow if the conditions are right. And so I think it boils down to what Craig's been speaking about in terms of looking at these issues from an ecosystem perspective. If we can get that right, it's not just the African penguin that benefits. It's the Cape cormorant, the Cape gannet, other seabirds, other cetaceans that rely on this, other fish species. And so we're really looking at trying to, at a policy level, have the approach to this change. In a sense, it is an ecosystem approach. And so the managing authorities who manage the colonies on the ground are doing everything they can in terms of dealing with the threats and pressures. And now we really need to have a look at what needs to be done within the marine ecosystem, you know, at a much greater intensity, and that's where our focus is now. And if we're able to do that, we will be able to do what we can and hopefully turn things around for the African penguin. But bearing in mind, this is not the Cape gannet is endangered, the Cape cormorant is endangered. There's concern about the brooders whales, as Craig mentioned. There's concern around other commercial fish species. So yeah, really looking at it from a policy change in terms of how we manage the marine ecosystem. I don't know, Craig, if you want to add to that, and Mark, if I've kind of addressed your question.
Yeah, Lauren, you're spot on, right? So I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lauren. I was just wondering whether any of you would like to leave us with a last little thought. I think that we should start ending now. There are a few questions that we haven't answered, but we can make sure that those questions get to you and are still responded to. There was a nice little comment that I saw from Jindrich Kromi. I'm sure I'm saying his name really terribly, from the Czech Republic. He just said that he is feeling that he really appreciates all the work that you're doing, and that he would be happy to explore with you whether he could support you in some way financially. So that was a very sweet comment. But is there anything else that you would like to leave us with, or have we covered everything?
Kirsten, if I may, maybe just a take-home message. I mean, obviously, this is a very small group of people compared to the amount of people that needs to know about this issue. So one small request, and I think I probably can speak on behalf of the entire panel, is that share this information. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues. Get the word out there. I mean, awareness. In terms of what Judy is speaking about, that is an attempt that has been made. It's an ongoing process, but we would certainly like people on this call to amplify our messaging. Thanks, Kirsten.
Thank you. Super.
Yeah, and I think if I can maybe add, as Lauren also said, I think we are all optimists. As depressive as it is, I think we're all in it to win it, so to say. So I think we do all have the hope that we can turn it around. And I think as Craig said, I think that's why we need everybody's support, be it financially, be it through PR, advocacy, awareness, education. I think everybody can play a little role, and we just all do our own little roles. But yes, you might know a journalist, or you might know somebody who works in investment banking, or so there's a lot of different ways to help the African penguin, and you don't have to be a marine biologist to do that. I think everybody can play their role. So yeah, and we haven't given up yet.
And maybe, Kirsten, if I can also add to that, is the African penguin is one of, or probably the most studied seabird in South Africa. We know more about this species than we do any other, and it is the most endangered. And it's a slippery slope. We know that there's actions that can be done at a scale and a level that are not being done. If we have information at hand and we're not using that information to save the species, we will lose it. Then it's going to be easier to make the same mistake, and we're going to lose the next one and the next one. So we really need to realize that, yeah, like all of the others have said, getting that awareness out there and making sure that people are making the decisions and enforcing what's needed to be done, because this is just one species of many that are at risk. And we need to get decision makers to put those in place. And as Craig has mentioned, it's not just for the people that are directly involved with African penguins. Everybody has a role to play in terms of species conservation. We, by the virtue of the fact that we're on this planet, we have a responsibility, and it cannot just be for the people that are actively engaged. Our role is to do the work and to do the research and get the information out, but the public and the needs to care enough to support the actions that are needed. So yeah, if we can't do it for this species that we know so much about, it's really concerning. And so please distribute this, make people aware, and get involved. If it's not the African penguin, get involved with other species, other conservation initiatives, because conservation is everybody's business and responsibility.
Thanks, Lauren. Very sobering. Alistair and Lorianne, would you like to add anything? No?
No, I think the others have covered it really well. So yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. I see that there is a little comment in the chat that said, John yelled, he says, thanks so much to all the panelists and to all those many others who are also trying desperately to save this wonderful bird. We really can't fail. It's just unthinkable that the African penguin can become functionally extinct in our lifetimes. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. I think that it's been a very informative and moving evening. And yeah, again, we just really appreciate everything that you're doing. And I feel very motivated to pull my weight as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a great evening still.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
Bye.